Hi, I'm Katie and this is Sam. Welcome to Mums All Together, and we're going to take you through a 20-minute return to running. So we're going to start with low impact and make sure that we're putting you in the right positions and getting the right muscles connecting so that as and when you feel ready for returning to running, you're all set. So we're going to start standing, and I want to start with a little bit of balance work in the feet, just checking where the weight is. So I'm going to turn to face the side so you can see my alignment. I'm going to put one hand on my breastbone and I'm going to soften my knees slightly. And I want you to see if you can take your breastbone really far forward of your hips, and then see if you can take that breastbone really far back of your hips. So we're finding a place in the middle. We want the breastbone to be above or slightly forward of the pubic bone, and then find a little bit of weight in the feet. So where is the weight distribution in your feet? See if you can slide the weight in towards your toes, and then slide that weight back in towards your heels so that you're finding weight into the toes. Try and keep the heels connected to the floor, and then bring that weight back into the heels. So even when we talk about setting ourselves up for running, when we align ourselves and align our spine, depending on where the weight placement is in our feet and where the weight placement is in our torso, will depend on what muscles activate to keep us propelling forward. So if I turn to face front on now, we're going to do exactly the same thing, but slide our weight from side to side. So what happens when you slide your weight all the way over and then coming through center all the way over? So where is the weight in your feet? Do you think maybe you have a tendency to sit in one hip, drop in one hip? How does it feel to think of really placing the weight evenly between one side and the other? So making sure that we stay nice and centered. And I want you to take this on a little round the world here. So we're going to the side, we're going around the front, other side, and back. And then send it the other way. Send the weight into the heels, around to the side, onto the toes, and back, like one of those little wibble wobble men toys. Side, front, side, back. I should say wibble wobble women toys. Side, front, side, and back. So even within setting ourselves up well, there is a lot of room for moving and shifting to side. And I want you, as much as you can for this, to try and think of things coming around to the center and wrapping and holding in the middle. We're going to make some little pew pew with our fingertips and place our fingertips just on the front of our hip bones. So don't think about the hips in their entirety, just find the hip bones, and thumbs just relax along the back of the hip. And I want you to slide your weight into your left foot. And when we slide, think of your hips staying level and just a shh from side to side. And if you had a dinner plate and it sat on your pelvis, it wouldn't tip and you wouldn't tip anything off. I often use a silver platter with a whole stack of champagne flutes as my cue. So people aren't so bothered about dinner, but they're more bothered about champagne, myself included. Sliding it from side to side. Good, and find that spot in the middle. We're going to change our hand position. You're going to bring your thumbs to the top of your ribs and your fingertips to the front of your hips. And again, I want you to find the action here. So if I turn to the side once more, what happens if you condense? Can you get your ribs and your hips closer to one another? And then what happens if you pull apart, sending your ribs and hips further apart? So pulling together and sliding apart. I'm going to do 2 more of these, pulling together, sliding apart, as if you are a human accordion, concertinaing through that midsection, and then extending out, and almost finding that pop between the ribs and the hips. So come back to center and find the space where your ribs and your hips feel like they can sit and sit supported. And notice maybe, have you started to lock into your legs? Have you started to throw that weight back? We're going to keep the knees soft. We're going to bring that weight up and forward a bit more. And from here, I'm going to turn around this way and come to the back of my mat. We're going to take a few lunge sequences. So keeping in mind that weight distribution, keeping in mind the connection between ribs and hips and your pelvic position, which you can alter at any point. We're just going to start with a really small range step forward. So just nice and small. You don't have to go too far to start with, but I want you to feel like you're driving that front heel down into the floor and lift the back toe off. I'm going to join my fingers together just so I've got a little bit of pressure at the front, which encourages that wrap around. So you can have fingertips together or maybe a prayer hand here. I'm just going to take a little bend and stretch into that front leg. Little bend, little stretch, little bend, little stretch, a little bend, little stretch, a little bend, and a little stretch. Keep going with this. Now, if this feels enough for you and your range feels enough here, stay here. If you would like more of a challenge, feel free to step that foot a little further forward. If this is awkward in your hips or you feel like your pelvic floor is becoming compromised, reset yourself nice and narrow. You can be as narrow as you need to be here and work up to a bigger distance. So once I've taken a little bit of a larger stance, I'm watching what happens in my pelvis. Naturally, we want to tip that pelvis forward. So I want you to think of your pubic bone. And as you're in that bend, scoop your pubic bone towards your nose, find your breastbone, and breastbone is above or maybe slightly forward of that pubic bone, stretching into the legs and bending down again. Now, weight distribution is really important here. Ordinarily, we have the weight spread between the toes and the heels. But I find that if I have all of my weight in the ball of my foot and my toes, that my quad dies first. And I really want to fire the glute here. And I really want to keep that glute connection strong. So I'm going to try and take my toes off the floor and press down into that heel, and then press into that heel to find my stretch. Bending down and stretching up. And hopefully you can feel the difference when we allow that heel to really connect. This activates what we call our posterior chain. So from the back of the heel, through the back of the calf, back of the hamstring, and into the glute. We're going to take 2 more. Good. Last one. Hold that bend. Now, arms can stay up here. This helps me keep my upper body lifted. Hands can come to hips. But I want you really to, again, pay attention to what's happening in your pelvis. Can you maybe scoop that pelvis underneath a little more? And then the ribs and the hips. We want the ribs and the hips to be the same distance away from one another on both sides. So almost feel like you're trying to stretch out through that hip flexor on this side. And we're going to take a tiny pulse. Keep the focus in your front heel. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, last 3, last 2, last one, hold it here. Now shift your focus to your back kneecap, still keeping the weight out of the front of the toes, aiming for a vertical shin bone on your front leg as we pulse the back kneecap towards the floor for 8, 7, 6, last 5, last 4, last 3, last 2, last one. Hold for a microsecond. Find that drive down into that front heel. Transfer the weight into the front leg, stepping the back foot to the front, lifting up, and maybe you just want to give yourself a little wiggle and a shake out. So it's not just about the action of the lunge or the shape of the lunge, it's when we're in the lunge, how we find what we're working. And I find the more I can keep my shin bone as close to vertical as possible, it's impossible to keep it there the whole time. And the more I can really think of driving that front heel into the floor while keeping my tailbone underneath and my ribs and hips connected, all of a sudden it becomes a completely different exercise. So the great news is you've got 2 legs, and we're going to repeat this on the other side. So come back in your space. You just need enough space in front of you to be able to step forward. Keep the shoulders relaxed. Start with the hands on the hips, and with your left leg, take a big step forwards. Now, if you need to, this step doesn't have to be big. It can be tiny, and you can start that repair work here from nice and narrow. So wherever you've placed yourself, lift the back heel off the floor and find that resistance of the front heel in. And we're just going to start with that simple bend and stretch. Bend and stretch. Bend and stretch. One of the most important things, especially when we're looking at rebuilding to returning to running, is our tracking. So have a look at what that front knee is doing. In an ideal world, we want that front knee tracking over the second and third toes, especially while our ligaments are still lax and we're still repairing and rebuilding after childbirth. Strength through the ankles, alignment through the leg, and tracking of the knees over toes is super important. So I don't mind if this is the smallest movement you can manage, but keep that tracking nice and even. Think of the back heel and be mindful of any sickling through the back heel. So if I face the front, a sickle would be when my ankle starts to pop out to the side like this. We want to really try and bring that ankle into line with the heel, so the heel and the ankle stay in a straight line. Feel free to make this a larger lunge if that's your challenge. And be mindful of what your pelvis is doing. Can you scoop your pubic bone towards your nose a little more? Is your breastbone definitely forward of your pubic bone? How about the ribs and hips? Are they level, or have you started to lean into one side and make that distance shorter on one side than the other? Last 4, last 3, last 2, last 1. Hold that lunge down. I'm going to bring my hands in front of me, either pressing the fingertips together or the heels of my hands together. Absolutely fine to take your hands to your hips here. Focus on that front heel. I'm going to try and almost wing my toes off the floor as I concentrate on the front heel for a little pulse. Pulse down. Pulse down. It doesn't have to be a big movement, but I want you to think of keeping your weight centered in between both feet. If the weight goes too far forward or too far back, we change the focus of this exercise. And we really want to keep those hips nice and stable as we bend and stretch here, making sure that as and when we return to even fast walking or running, we've got that stability and we're strong in all the right places to support it. Last 2. Last 1, hold it down. From here, change your focus now to your back kneecap, pressing down. And we've got 8, 7, and even though your legs are tired, keep the front of the torso supporting. Try not to let it relax and flop out. You want to keep it lifted and drawing in. Last 3, last 2, last 1, hold it down. Transfer the weight into that front foot, step the back foot to the front foot, and lift all the way up, really nice. We're going to stay facing this side, but I'm just going to turn around this way, just for a bit of variety. Heels under our hips, toes tracking forward. We're going to lift the arms up. I like my palms to the floor for this, but be wherever it feels comfortable for you. And again, find that sweet spot of weight distribution here. Softening the knees, we're going to take a pelvic tilt in this position. So scoop forward and drive back. Scoop forward and drive back. You might find, especially as you start to repair, that this range of movement is really small, and that's absolutely fine. Take it wherever it is, just finding some mobility. Making sure that the toes are underneath the center of the ankles, knees, and hips, and that we're not overpronating or underpronating. Knees are still directly over those second and third toes. Find the sweet spot. Find the place where it honestly just feels good for you. Whether that's an exaggerated tuck underneath, whether that's an extension, or whether that is relatively neutral. From here, we're going to start to take a little heel lift. Lift the heels and lower the heels. Lift the heels and lower the heels. And I'm just going to face the front so you can see my ankles. But as we're lifting, we're aiming to keep our ankles in line with our heels. So we don't want those heels to start flicking out, and we don't want those heels to start dropping in. As much as we can, we're trying to keep them nice and centered through the center. Good. If you would like to make this more of a challenge, feel free to close your eyes. And this is a really good way of finding out exactly where you are in space. And ideally, you want to take just as long to lift as you do to lower. Inhaling to lift and exhaling to lower. And if you find that you keep dropping back, potentially pop your weight just a little further forward. If you find that you're falling forward, maybe connect the ribs and hips a little more. And it should feel like someone has a string from your crown and they're just lifting you up and lowering you down. Last one, we're going to hold the lift of the heels. So with my palms facing the floor here, I'm going to see how far I can slide myself down into a bend. So start slow with me and Sam, and we'll start to increase our range of movement. Inhaling as you lower, exhaling as you lift. Inhaling as you lower, exhaling as you lift. See if you can challenge that range a little more. Inhaling as you lower. Exhaling as you lift. Inhaling as you lower. Exhaling as you lift. Let's see if we can challenge it to our maximum range, wherever that is for you today. And lift. Keep your hips above the height of your knees. So as you bend, you never want to hit this position. One, because it's really awful to try and get back up from, but two, is it just changes the focus of the exercise. Last one, inhaling to bend, exhaling to stretch, and lower down. Good, give your legs a little wiggle and a shake. Hopefully heart rate has lifted a little bit and we're feeling nice and warm now. So we're going to practice just moving with the hips static. So I want you to think of keeping the hips still, the frame of the hip work still, and just letting your femur bone work within the hip socket. So we're going to transfer our weight over to one side and see if we can lift the thigh bone towards the nose. So this is the same action as when we're on the floor and we take a single leg tabletop. From here, we're going to see if we can send the weight back behind us and back forward. Bring it back down, slide to the other side. Lift, keep the pelvis level and think of that thigh bone scooping up. So it should feel like the abs wrap around to help lift the leg rather than just the hip flexor or the quad. And we're going to slide that leg back and forward. Slide, lift, and use your own tempo for this as well as your own range. But that action of keeping our pelvis still and thinking of the thigh bone moving in the hip socket is awesome for making sure that we can return to running safely. Lifting, even if you're not a runner, these are really great exercises for rebuilding that strength around the pelvis, around the core, and that coordination of using your limbs while also keeping that core nice and engaged. Remember that small range is absolutely fine. If it's just a little lift forward and a little press back, absolutely fine. You don't have to go for a huge range to start with. The idea is that we build and we start to increase our range and we start to increase our endurance too. Let's go last two. And notice how your weight has to shift as the placement of your leg changes. Last one. Back, center, and down. Really nice. Coming towards the back of your mat, so there's an expanse in front of you, we're going to roll down into a 4-point kneeling position. So take your time, nice full breath in at the top. Breath out, chin to chest, roll the shoulders over and down, soft knees, long arms, and then walk out to that 4-point kneeling position. Just take a little swing of your hips from side to side, just easing out. And then if it's available for you, we're going to bring our right leg in between our hands towards the side of this hand. Send the weight up and forward until the shin bone is nice and parallel. If this isn't available for you, try a couple of yoga blocks from side to side, a couple of cushions, a couple of books stacked so that it's not such an acute angle, as it is quite an acute angle with the fingertips on the floor. And from here, I'm going to get you to slowly shuffle your foot forwards and see if you can sink your hips down. Make sure that this feels comfortable and not overstretched. If it feels too much, come back. And again, feel free to grab a couple of stacks of books if you have a yoga block, anything that's sturdy and strong that you can find a lift with if you need. Now from here, if this is enough, stay here. For an extra stretch, bring one hand onto the front of the thigh, second hand onto the front of the thigh and lift. And I want you to find a sink down into that stretch. Last challenge is one arm all the way up to the ceiling before we place one hand back down to the floor, other hand back down to the floor, coming into that 4-point kneeling position. Little windscreen wiper hip from side to side here, and then opposite foot forwards. Find the right position for you, and if you need to shuffle yourself forward or back a touch, that's fine. And find that sink down into this stretch. Again, using any props that you need to. Hands on blocks, hands on books, hands on a coffee table if you need to. Then when you're ready, one hand can come to the front of your thigh, other hand up, and find that sink down, lengthening across the front of that hip flexor. Challenge is to lift one arm and come all the way back down. Hands down to your mat, bring the foot back, and we're gonna sit. Really wonderful work. Rebuilding with this slowly is going to be a great way to get back to running. So don't panic if you can't do all of it. Just sprinkle it in and keep going with your range and keep going with the repetition. We love to hear how you found things, so leave us a comment and tell us what you loved and what you'd like to see more of. And we'll see you next time.